Hey everyone, welcome to The Explainer. So today we're jumping into a seriously incredible piece of history. Imagine this, a society that literally goes from carving out mountains to constructing these massive, soaring structural masterpieces, and they do it in just a handful of decades. Well, that's exactly what went down in ancient Tamil Nadu, all thanks to the super ambitious Pallava dynasty. Let's get into it. But, before we get into all the heavy lifting of stones and empires, I want you to think about something. How did South Indian temples actually get that iconic look? If you've ever seen those incredible, towering, insanely detailed skylines of temples down in southern India, you know exactly the look I mean. They didn't just magic out of thin air, right? There had to be a starting point, a specific moment of pure genius that basically set the blueprint for the next 1,000 years. So, where did those blueprints actually come from? Okay, let's dive into this. We're going to break this down into 5 parts today. First up, the Pallava Revolution. Then, carving mountains, rock-cut temples. After that, we'll hit the structural temple leap, explore the marvels of Kanchipuram, and wrap it all up with an enduring stone legacy. All right, starting right off with Section 1, the Pallava Architectural Revolution. So the Pallavas were really these ambitious pioneers who essentially laid the ground rules for medieval South Indian architecture. Basically, they looked at the old brick and timber buildings and said, no, we want something that's going to last forever. And in doing that, they established what we call Dravidian architecture. If you're not familiar, that's a distinct style known for its massive pyramidal towers called Vimanas and these gorgeous pillared halls known as Mandapas. Honestly, whenever you see a towering stepped pyramid above a temple's inner sanctum today, you're looking directly at the architectural DNA that the Pallavas dreamed up. Which perfectly tees up Section 2, carving mountains, rock-cut temples. Okay, picture this. In their earliest days, building a temple literally meant subtracting rock until a structure was left behind. It's wild. And the craziest part is how incredibly fast they evolved. In 610 AD, the Mahendra phase kicks off with basic rock-cut caves. Just 20 years later, 630 AD, they're carving full monolithic chariots in the Mamalla phase. Fast forward a bit to 690 AD under King Rajasimha, and bam, they make the massive jump to freestanding masonry. We aren't talking about a slow crawl over thousands of years here. This was an absolute explosion of tech and innovation happening in just a few generations. And the guy who really kick-started the whole thing was King Mahendravarman I. They literally called him Vichitrachitta, which translates to the inventive-minded. I love this quote from his Mandagapattu inscription. He's totally bragging, declaring he just created a mansion completely brickless, timberless, metalless, and mortarless. It was a massive flex for the time. He created the very first cave temples carved directly into the super unforgiving southern granite, using absolutely nothing but raw stone and pure human willpower. Now, this bold, subtractive method, basically carving away what you don't need, hit its absolute peak with the Mamalla group. They created true monoliths, and a monolith is exactly what it sounds like, a structure formed out of a single giant block of stone. This is the mind-blowing stuff you see at Mahabalipuram, which is a UNESCO World Heritage Site today. The Pallava sculptors chiseled these majestic, chariot-shaped shrines, called the Pancharathas, entirely out of single granite boulders. Think about the pressure there. If you chip off the wrong piece, there's no starting over. You're just done. But hey, even absolute master carvers eventually hit a wall when they're tied to a single rock. And that brings us to Section 3, the structural temple leap. So think about the physical limits of carving a temple out of a rock face versus actually building one from the ground up. With a cave or a monolith, your temple can literally only ever be as big as the boulder you happen to find, right? You're basically trapped by geology. But the moment you switch to structural architecture, where you're carving independent stones and stacking them up with mortar, suddenly it's a whole new ballgame. The only limit is the sky. You get this ultimate freedom to design, expand, and just build upwards. This really highlights the crucial takeaway here, the incredible speed of their adaptation. Notice how, by the time we hit the Rajasimha era, the rules completely change. They officially graduate from caves and monoliths into this new era of independently carved square and rectangular stones. They figure out how to arrange these pieces one by one to build intricate walls, majestic ceilings, and, most importantly, those massive towering Vimanas right over the shrines. Of course, once you invent a new way to build, you need a place to show it off. Welcome to Section 4, the marvels of Kanchipuram. Kanchipuram essentially became the vibrant epicenter and the ultimate testing ground for this structural boom. Academic research shows Kanchipuram popping up a lot in early Tamil literature and later records as this crucial laboratory where sculptures finally graduated to freestanding shrines. Because the Pallava Empire was so vast, stretching all the way from the Krishna to the Kaveri rivers, insane amounts of wealth and resources just poured into this one city. And the result, some of the most stunning temples on the planet. The absolute crown jewel of Kanchipuram has to be the Kailasanathar temple, built by King Rajasimha. It's got this lofty pyramidal tower, a real Vimana, and it's surrounded by all these smaller, deeply intricate shrines. But here's a totally wild historical quirk for you. The temple is built out of sandstone, which is super friable. It weathers really easily. So how did these incredibly detailed sculptures of Shiva, Brahma, and Vishnu survive 1,000 years? Well, at some later point, somebody covered them in plaster. Yeah, the plaster actually shielded the soft stonework from centuries of rain and wind, acting like a protective time capsule for the ancient art underneath. Talk about a happy accident. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is this other masterpiece in Kanchipuram, the Sri Vaikunta Perumal Temple, built by Nandivarman II. Its coolest feature is the cloister mandapa, or pillared corridor. Imagine walking down this long stone hallway where the inner walls are completely covered in paneled sculptures. And they aren't just there to look pretty, they're essentially a visual history book. They narrate the entire history of the Pallavas, from their legendary ancestors all the way to the king who commissioned the building. They were quite literally using structural architecture to carve their legacy into eternity. And you know what's fascinating? You can actually track this growing architectural maturity just by looking at the pillars. In the early days, they start off with these massive, really plain shapes that almost look like basic Buddhist railing posts. But then they evolve into these super iconic pillars with bases carved into sitting lions. And eventually, in later Kanchipuram temples like Matangashwara, you see them morphing into these incredibly complex pillars featuring rearing yalis, which are these fierce mythical beasts complete with little riders on top. The craftsmanship literally gets more confident and more complex with every single generation. All of this unbelievable innovation brings us to our final section, Section 5, an enduring stone legacy. Because understanding the Pallavas isn't just about admiring a bunch of old rocks, right? It's about looking at what actually lasts. To put things into perspective, look at this excerpt describing nearby Chennai today. It talks about unplanned and unbridled construction. High-rises and concrete development are just exploding across the landscape. We live in this era of cheap materials, quick fixes, and hyper-fast urbanization. And man, it forms such a jarring contrast to those thoughtful, meticulously carved, eternal stone temples just down the highway. The Pallavas were building for millennia. Meanwhile, today, we often struggle to build something that'll survive a single century. And that right there is why the Pallava legacy is so incredibly vital. By figuring out how to build upwards using cut stone, these inventive kings didn't just build a few local shrines. They inspired the massive, mind-boggling Chola temples that came later, like the 60-meter Vrihadishwara temple. They literally set the gold standard for Dravidian design. They created UNESCO World Heritage sites that still leave us in awe today. And most impressively, their mortarless, timberless architectural experiments have proudly stood their ground against over 1,000 years of history. So I want to leave you with a final thought today. As our modern cities rapidly expand around these monuments in a giant flurry of concrete and steel, how will these ancient stone blueprints inspire the next millennium of design? Will we ever look back at the curious, inventive minds of the Pallavas to rediscover how to build with real purpose, beauty, and permanence? Anyway, thank you so much for joining me in this explainer. I really hope this deep dive has completely changed how you look at the towering skylines of South India. Keep learning, keep exploring, and I'll catch you in the next one.